divided speaker sessions. This one is going to be concentrated on cognition across diverse populations. We have 4 speakers today. 2 of them are going to be here in person, and 2 of them are going to be virtual. The first of them is Marisa Casillas, which I'm very, very happy to welcome to the stage.
All right, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to sharing with you the stuff that I'm gonna. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Okay, great. I'm gonna take my glasses off because I need a little bit more signal input. To share with you today some of the work that I've been doing, but also framing it in a way that is kind of open to the directions in which I'm trying to go. And so some of this will be reporting on past work, but a lot of it is actually thinking in terms of aspirations for future work. So I hope that will be good for you as well. All right, so when we think about child language development or developmental psycholinguistics, what we're talking about is a domain of science that is derived along the lines of the biological sciences, right? Our scientific project is identifying the universalism behind language learning, the language learning toolkit that enables humans to create the linguistic systems that they do. And this gets us interested in finding out what the kinds of underlying consistencies and similarities are across diverse environments. And that's one way in which diversity can inform theories about language learning. So, you can think of this as, instead of a human, a bean, like a human being. So here the bean is kind of gradually moving toward maturity over time. There are kinds of some critical ingredients that are required for the bean to follow this trajectory. And if we were plant biologists, we might be studying aspects of the internal mechanisms that allow this organism to respond to its environment in a way that moves it toward maturity. Okay, that's not actually that far off from a lot of how we think about child language development. And so what we end up doing is kind of taking a framing of thinking of babies as brains, right? We're interested in this toolkit, so we're thinking about the kinds of cognitive traits, the motor aspects, and maturational traits and more that may play into this toolkit that explains how children across diverse contexts so robustly learn language. When we try to create theoretical models about this, what we end up doing is kind of creating models that can optimize output to more or less extents, and the output itself is language. It's the linguistic system that's being acquired. And that's how we have tended to think about this for a long time. That's also how I think about this. I'm a linguist by training, right? Language as its own system, apart from everything else. And of course, because of this framing, we also take a focus on similarities. However, I would like to propose that if we're going to move forward in this field and take diversity seriously, in my personal experience conducting fieldwork in communities where children are growing up under quite different circumstances from the ones in their own backyards, I think we should take a different approach of thinking of babies as people rather than brains. And that this simple turn of phrase might actually help us understand the kinds of changes that we might need to make. So whereas we still can think about these various traits that may be part of our universal toolkit for language learning, I think that instead of thinking about kind of the ways that the theories can predict more or less language, for example, we should be thinking about how language is relating to the social expectations that children are acquiring as they're going around the world. And so instead of language being the output, sociality is the output, and language is a subsystem of acquiring your social competence within a community. Similarly, instead of focusing on similarities, what we should be doing is focusing on adaptation, trying to understand not just what the commonalities are, but how they are interacting with the environment to kind of specialize and adapt to whatever it is that is relevant for that organism in that particular local context. Okay, one pithy phrase I like to use, many paths to language, right? That's one way in which we can think about the many different ways in which children come to competence in using language with speakers in their community. Okay, but how do we actually bring variability into these core theoretical models that we've built up for decades, that we have lots of great empirical data supporting? How do we go from something like this to something like this, right, where we're talking about localized responses to the environment? So in my own work, what I do is examine child language development across multiple cultural contexts. In particular, I will focus quite a lot today on my work in these two communities because I have a parallel line of research in each one of them. In the Russell Island community in Papua New Guinea, children grow up speaking a language called Yelitnye, and ethnographic work has characterized the style of caregiver-child interaction as being child-centric. Maybe not so different from what you might do if you encountered a small child in your life, right? On the other hand, in the Tseltal Mayan community where I work, where children are learning a language called Tseltal, the same kind of ethnographic work has characterized these relationships as being non-child-centric. So children are expected to orient to what's going on around them rather than expecting to be the center of attention themselves. And that's kind of implicitly and explicitly encouraged of them from early infancy. Okay. Now, while there's this kind of critical difference in terms of ideologies about child rearing, there are a lot of similarities between these sites, which I think is why they make a nicer comparison to each other than either one would to, for example, American infants. But what we do in each site is try and get a relatively well-rounded look at what language development looks like. And so I'm just going to show you some images from Russell Island, but we have similar kind of data from both sites. So first, we do day-long recordings, in which case we have the child and sometimes the parent wear gear as they go about a whole waking day at home. And we record the day from their perspective, especially the audio from their perspective. We also do various controlled elicitation tasks to try and get basically more data on stuff that is hard to observe spontaneously. And then finally, we run a number of various behavioral experiments with kids. And if you're noticing the same person in these two photos, that is Takama. She's a very talented experimenter on Russell Island. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is going to mostly focus on the observational data, observational analyses from the day-long recordings of child language, as well as a little bit of the behavioral experiment stuff. Okay, and when I'm thinking about how it is that environment might impact language development in interesting ways, I will kind of touch on three topics. And these are not topics that I went into these communities already knowing were interesting. These are topics that kind of emerge on their own as relevant as I have continued to do work here. So one, I'll talk about kinship term development. Two, I'll talk about attempting to identify activities and there being some presence of activity as an important thing in the data. And three, I'll talk about interactants, who the child is actually talking to. Okay, so beginning with kinship. Here I'm just going to talk about Russell Island, but a lot of these things also apply to the Tseltal Mayan community. On Russell Island, like many small rural communities, kinship relations are highly salient, right? Pretty much everyone is kin of one kind or another. You have to be able to greet people appropriately. You have to know what your mutual obligations to them are, kinship, land inheritance, who you can get to rally behind you in the case of conflict, who's kind of organizing in your major life events, and so on and so forth. Russell itself has a kinship term system with a lot of complexity. I won't go into it now. But for a couple of different reasons, we think that these words and these concepts might be difficult for kids to acquire. At the same time, if anyone's going to have facility in acquiring them, it should be kids on Russell Island because they're doing this day and night, every day of their lives. Okay, so we're going to do a little experiment together. We're going to play T Kala Kala. T Kala Kala is a native game. It is a form of informal pedagogy. Parents are trying to get their kids to have knowledge of their ancestral kin. So we'll see how well you do. So normally on Ross Island, you could just say T Kala Kala, and that will get the kids started on doing the game, but I'll help you through it. So without saying aloud, what is your dad's name? Okay, what is his father's name? All right, what is his father's name? What is his father's name? Who's still in? Okay, what is his father's name? His father's name? Nice, you might be the record holder. Okay, so I'm betting that most of you petered out around 2 or 3. On Russell Island, we tested this with 70 kids between ages 5 and 17, both of their father's fathers and their mother's mothers. And these kids know their ancestors, okay? So on their father's side, the average is 7 going up to 11 generations back. We have verified these. On their mother's side, there's an average of 3 going up to 7, right? And this difference between fathers and mothers co-varies with the kind of cultural importance of knowing one line versus the other. So you might say, okay, this is actually mostly rote memorized information. There's nothing that should be interesting cognitively about this. Well, we have tested them in other ways. So we can play a second game called What is an X to you, right? So your mother's brother is a what to you. Your mother's sister is a what to you. I mean, given time, I'm sure we can all answer all of these, right? So this is the set of stimuli. English has fewer kin terms, so in English you'll have the same answer to a whole bunch of these, and Russell not. But the orange ones I've highlighted in particular because depending on the sex of yourself and the linking relative, you have to use a different term. So this is another way of testing now, okay, how are we getting at their relational knowledge? How are they getting into the algebra of this kinship calculus, right? And here we see also that children are pretty good at it. Remember, there's open response, right? So the chance is not at 50 here, chance is not responding basically. So already at age 5 and 6, we have kids around 50% of these questions getting them right, with an average of 70% across our sample. And we have an even harder one where we do triangulation that I won't talk too much about, but basically you observe your father greeting someone and then you have to calculate quickly what your name for them is, depending on kinship relation. Okay, so in brief, the ubiquity of kin and the social importance of kin for your everyday life is something that kids pick up on and they're entrained to attend to from very, very early. We think this is something that influences their lexical development in terms of their knowledge of kinship terms and how kin relate to each other. And it's not just Russell Island. So I will just briefly highlight the work of Ruthie Fouché. She has been looking at, actually at Seltal community, not exactly the same one where I do field work, but quite close by, how very young children already recognize the difference between different quite similar but different honorifics that they hear used in a socially important way every day. Like I've been in that community too, all the time. Okay, so for activity, this one I'm just getting into. Actually, you can see that I've been foiled in trying to get into activity a couple of times. And a lot of this is derived from these day-long recordings where kids are wearing audio and photo capturing cameras over most of the day. So I'll talk here about rates of directed linguistic input, essentially how often do people talk to children. That's what I'm capturing with this TCDS measure here. And these are all kids under age 3. The thing is, when we tried to look at this from the day-long recording, we looked at it in 2 ways. We looked at a random baseline, just selecting clips at random from the day, and a sample of clips that were of the peak interactional points for the day. And the only point I want to make here is that there's a really big difference, right? You're seeing 3 to 3.5 minutes per hour from the random clips, and somewhere around 13 to 14 for the interactional peaks. So there's some kind of underlying activity type thing that's going on, but is not really explained here. That's going to really change our idea of what's happening in terms of children's linguistic input at any given moment in time. So if we look for time of day effects, we can see that target child-directed speech, this input, is most frequent in the mornings. This is somewhat modulated by age, but that's still not clear what's actually driving this effect. Is it just that there are more people around to talk to? Is this some kind of like daily schedule? What's the routine like? Well, I have not been able to establish one. The vast majority of families in each of these communities where I've collected data are small-scale subsistence farmers. And so while you might think that the schedule looks pretty regular, these are the number of people who are present with, on the y-axis, so time of day on the x-axis, sorted from the youngest kid at 2 months here to the oldest kid at 48 months here in rows going across. And you can see that while there are a few cases that you can say, oh, all right, more people equals more speech in the morning, that's the end of the story, that is certainly not the case for most of the kids. And that is equally true for the Russell Island data as well. So we need actually activity context to better understand what kinds of fluctuations children are going on with in their day. Another way we're trying to do this is to actually look at those photo data to see what it is that children are holding as they go around. And this is work you will hear a lot more about from Kennedy Casey tomorrow if you go to her Sticks, Leaves, Buckets, and Bowls talk. Here's some example of things that children hold and the categories they're in. These are day-long recordings from 80 children, and we've manually annotated over 110,000 photos for a variety of things about the objects that they're holding. And just to pick out one finding relating to the idea of activity type effects, if you look at the object tokens per hour that children are engaging with across these different categories, we start to see differences emerge between the communities that are consistent with the shape of everyday life, the socio-historical context of what these kids are growing up in, right? Where the Russell Island kids who spend a lot of time in their day socializing with others on verandas have a lot of immovable objects that they interact with as they're crawling up the stairs, running around on the surface of the veranda, holding onto the posts, looking over the edges of the walls, coming in and out of doors, right? On the other hand, for the Tall case in orange, we see more cases of using synthetic objects and toys that are going to be more readily available in the Tall community because of their significantly greater market integration. Okay, so moving on to the third thing, just briefly, child rearing under the banner of alloparenting and care from older siblings. One way we can think about this is who it is that's actually talking to the child. So in these data from the ECLU project, we compared day-long recording in as parallel a way as possible from 5 different corpora, 2 in English, 1 in Argentine Spanish, and then Tall and Yuletnier. And here I just want to note what we're looking at is not target child-directed speech, but child-directed speech in general. So this could be speech to another child nearby. That rate of speech from women is actually surprisingly similar across all of these very culturally different corpora. The rate from men is also similar, but much lower overall, replicating a finding that I think will not surprise too many people, that child-directed speech is much more likely to come from women than men in a naturalistic day-long context. However, what seems to really differ cross-culturally is speech coming from other children. And here you can really see the difference in between the 2 indigenous contexts that we've included here that are small-scale societies where children are spending a lot of time with close kin in terms of the amount of linguistic input that children are getting from other children nearby. If you think that that's just our wonky data, I hope that you will think otherwise when you see completely independent analyses from Camilla Scaff looking at children learning Chimane in Bolivia. And in here, she's done it 2 ways in terms of proportion of input and also in terms of turn-taking patterns. Who do kids actually do turn transitions with? Okay, and why might this matter for language output? Here, I don't have as many direct connections to potential learning outputs as I did in the nice kinship experiments. And I'd like to also point you to a talk from Stephen Elmlinger later today, looking at how Mayan caregivers actually change their utterances following infant vocalizations. But there are a couple of things, right? Like, we would think that other children versus adults produce infant-directed speech differently. Perhaps adults are able to make different kinds of addressee adaptations for children that make some things more learnable, for example. We have models of speaker variability and phonological representations that are going to be affected by how many and what types of speakers children generally encounter. Adults and children are likely to produce different topic styles and grammatical features of talk. We know that there's work showing that children generally prefer adults as experts for learning social things like words, but it may well be that that looks a little bit different in these communities where children are being cared for by other children quite a lot of the time. And also thinking about overhearable or observable language input, there is potentially a lot to be looked at in these communities. There are a lot of people around, and there are a lot of interesting conversations to be attended to. Okay, so starting to wrap up a bit, I think that we can simplify all of this in a couple of ways. We can think about children as learning what is expected of me. What will I do today? Who will I interact with? It seems obvious to me, at least, that the answers to all of these questions are going to have a huge influence over children's experience with language and thereby their learning of language, both the process of getting that information in and also ultimately what they do with their language competencies. And the answers to these questions are going to vary a lot cross-culturally. This infant here has a very small social world, and the kinds of expectations, activities, and interactions are very different for her than the two communities that I just described. So when we're thinking about how we bring variability into our core theoretical models of language learning, I would like to propose that we kind of focus on these little tendrils that the plant is extending, trying to find what are the right affordances in my social environment for using language? What are the ways in which I can kind of hook onto language practices and get my input and do my own production practice through them? And so that's all I wanted to say. And I will briefly thank my various collaborators in the Cell Tall site, including Penny Brown, who has been working there since 1971, on Russell Island with Steve Levinson, who's been working there for quite some time, Kennedy, the amazing lab manager, and all of the RAs in the Chatter Lab who have coded so many photos, and U Chicago for all the coffee money. So thank you.
So, as I said, we're a little bit behind, but we have time for maybe one or two questions. So if anybody wants to ask a question, you can approach the microphones.
Hello. Very nice talk. Thank you. I'm just curious if you have any speculations about the much greater level of child input that turned out to be the case in Yeligny, because I'd always imagined and sort of felt like people thought that this would be more the case in Cell Tall, where the parents are not interacting with the child, but perhaps other children are. Do you have speculations about that?
Yeah, so I can go back to, I think the main, oh my gosh, I should have just. Okay, so I was also surprised by this. Part of the reason I was interested in doing this analysis and this comparison is because I expected higher baseline rates of directed speech to Russell children than Cell Tall children on the basis of the ethnographic work. It turns out that at the day-long scale, this is not true. And it's not even true in terms of, like, for example, their interactional peaks are different somehow. What I have come to realize, and part of why I came to have so much interest in activities, is that actually a lot of what's going on in terms of language socialization, which is very salient to people like Penny Brown, who are there on the ground and engaging deeply with people interactively, that's actually a lot more caught up in terms of these kind of moments of interaction that are much more circumscribed by context that is hard to articulate actually as an outsider. And so part of what I'm trying to do through my focus on activities now is to try and find ways into understanding how these specific contexts, shaped by routine, shaped by culture, shaped by age of the child, particular moment in history even, right? Because these are globalizing communities, things are changing, bilingualism is rising, how all of these things are going to contribute to what feels, and also feels to me, like very real differences in ideology and style of interaction, but at the like bird's eye view of input don't come out, right? And I think that like lack of parallelism between those findings is really interesting and tells us something important about how we should be pursuing this kind of comparative work.
I'm sorry, but we don't have time for more questions. Maybe you can talk to her afterwards.